Hey guys, I hope you're doing great, and this video is going to be stories that I found pretty scary or cool or whatever, but they were too short to put into their own video. So pull up a stump and let's jump into it. Thank you for watching. I've never told this story before, but I guess I'm in the mood. So my family has owned this vacation house on the Oregon coast since the 1960s. It's naturally a pretty dreary place. The neighborhood was heavily wooded and only about half a mile inland from the water. There are a few houses dotted around the woods, but this one particular house has always stuck out. It's been abandoned and boarded up my entire life. It always had an ominous vibe, if you can get what I'm talking about. Even the adults didn't like hanging out near this place. There were even a couple weather-worn wooden headstones on the property, which I always thought was super creepy and odd. My friends and I used to try to freak each other out by making dares on who would get the closest to the house. And one time I even remember seeing figures in the second-story windows at some points in my life that I forgot a long time ago. It was always just this unsettling place. So this one day, my friend John and I are bored at the coast. We are probably about maybe 8 years old, and we decided to go spook ourselves at the house. We walked down the gravel road toward the house, but something is different this time. The unsettling aura is completely gone. I even remember the weather clearing up and the area being covered in a warm, misty moss. Shortly after we arrive, a girl wearing a blue dress walks out from behind the house. She was our age and claimed that she and her family lived in the house. My friend and I were really confused because this place had been boarded up for as long as we could remember, but she seemed not to hear us. She asked us if we would join her for a tea party in her treehouse. We were surprised as we had never noticed a treehouse on the property before, but we happily joined her and hung out for what seemed like a few hours. At one point it was getting late and we needed to eat. We invited her to join us for supper, but she said her parents didn't want her to leave the property. We asked her if she could ask her parents about it, but she completely dismissed the idea. So we left and had dinner, and we told our parents about what happened, and for some reason my mom was very disturbed by the story. So sure enough, the next day we returned to the house, and it was now returned to its ominous state. We looked for evidence of our new friend, but there was no trace. The only clue that was left to us was the treehouse she had taken us to in the backyard. It was still there, but it was completely overgrown with lichen and entirely dilapidated and falling apart from years of near constant rain and the salty air. We tried to climb up to the treehouse, but it was too far gone and completely unsafe. My friend and I both remembered the story vividly, but unfortunately we had a huge falling out in middle school and we haven't spoken to each other since then. So I have no idea what he thinks about it, but looking back, it feels like a totally benign experience. I'm not sure if it was the ghost or an incident of like isolated time travel or parallel universes, I don't know. But it's always felt like one of the most true paranormal events that I've ever experienced in my life. So this happened when I was between 3 to 5 years old. I was living at my paternal grandparents' house at the border with Costa Rica. There's a small creek that runs in front of the house, and there's this wooden bridge that's maybe 3 to 4 meters long, 6 meters wide, that you have to pass in order to reach the house. The house is maybe 30 to 50 meters away from the bridge, but in the darkness, you can always hear somebody coming as they walk over the bridge by the sound it makes. So one day we're sitting around the small TV watching Sábado Gigante. My grandma, grandpa, my mom, and I. We hear the bridge, like the wooden boards, sound as if somebody is coming by bike. My grandma says, "Choco has arrived." Choco is the nickname of her youngest son, but nobody shows up. We continue watching TV, and then we keep hearing the sounds of the boards over and over again. Nobody says anything, but we keep waiting for somebody to show up. For context, you need to picture that there's only a few lights inside the house, and there's none of them pointing in the direction of the small bridge. My grandpa gets uneasy and asks my mom and I to go into our room. Here's a combination of what I remember versus what I was told, and I put them together. So my grandma is this badass Christian, religious, and my grandpa is a badass hunter. My grandma thinks that there's a witch or something messing with us in the night. Grandma grabs a blessed cross from a popular church that people go to in the middle of the country. The cross is made of palm tree leaves. My grandma starts praying and starts walking out to the bridge and tells whatever it is to stop bothering us and go away. Grandma walks to the bridge and slides the crucifix through the openings between the wooden boards on the bridge. Immediately after this, something huge drops from under the bridge and into the water and starts running downstream, making loud, weird yipping noises almost. Grandma falls back down praying. Grandpa proceeds to come out and help her up. Shortly after that, my uncle, who we were all expecting, finally shows up on his bike. Another experience when I was 15 years old or so. I go hunting with my dad and a couple of his brothers and grandpa. They love doing this, but I'd rather not spend nights in the jungle with mosquitoes, snakes, and all that stuff. My family owns land in the jungle, somewhere in the picture related, and I'll put the picture up here. There's a 2-story wooden cabin uphill from a creek in a valley that we hunt peccary, lowland paca, and deer. It takes 2 hours to walk to the cabin where the dogs and local hunters we are friends with are waiting for us. It's a clear sky with a full moon. We split into 2 different game trails in the valley. I'm in a hammock high up in this tree, and my dad is sitting in a branch next to me with a rifle. We all have walkie-talkies so as to tell each other or warn each other when we see something. Suddenly the dogs start barking and we all think that they found game. Everybody's on high alert. I don't have a gun because I'm a kid, but I have binoculars and a good overview of the valley. Suddenly hear a loud metallic sound. Kind of sounds like a rusty machine moving around or something like that. I notice my dad hears it too, and he asks me to give him the walkie-talkie. As he's about to ask if anybody heard it, the dogs go silent. My youngest uncle comes through the walkie-talkies and says, "Hey, do you see that light over the creek?" He's on the opposite side of the valley, so he can see farther to the east from the valley from where we are. My oldest uncle replies, "Yeah, it does look like it's kind of hovering over the creek. Do you hear the dogs?" Dad and I are listening to the conversation, and suddenly the light starts to pass in front of us. It slowly hovers over the creek as if it's following its path. The light is white and it's extremely bright. It lights up the entire forest like an LED lamp pointing towards a small patch of grass. The light makes that metallic sound, but not as loud as when it did when it showed up. It hovers over our cabin or hut, whatever, for a few seconds, and then continues down the creek path. The guy running down behind the dogs, down the valley, comes in and says, "Hey, who was shining that light? The dogs are scared shitless." He thinks that they saw a tiger or a puma or something. By tiger, I mean like the small kind of tiger. I don't have a picture. The youngest uncle tells them it wasn't us. Something just flew down the creek. He looks at my dad and says, "Bro, did you guys see it?" My dad says, "Yeah, we did." My dad and uncles talk for a bit about what to do. Dad wants to return to the cabin because I'm just a kid and I shouldn't be out in situations like this. The dogs are scared and crying and won't help with the hunt anymore, so we all come down from our spots toward the cabin. When we get to the cabin, there's a strange smell of burnt metal, but everything is in place. It had been maybe 30 to 45 minutes since the light was there. Eventually, I fall asleep in my hammock, and we all return to the city the next morning. Nothing else happened that night, but everybody was really on edge, especially the local guy who owned the hunting dogs. He had raised them since puppies, and he knows that they were not afraid of just anything, and not all of them at the same time afraid of the same thing. They all told hunting stories of weird stuff that would happen to them. Only in 2020 I saw these lights again, but not exactly similar. So later on, when I was 16 years old, we had been living in Panama City for about 10 years now. After renting all this time, we finally moved into our own house in the suburbs toward the west. I spend a lot of time studying because I go to an old renowned private high school where most subjects are taught in English. My room's desk is placed in front of a window, and the picture's there, so I'll show it to you. I have a rosary hanging down from one of the things you spin to open and close the glass windows. It's kind of short, and it's a metal rosary that my grandma gave me at some point. It doesn't have all the beads. I think it's just like 5 or so. It hangs there, and it can't fall because there's like a hook into it. So one day I'm studying in the afternoon, and as I sit there, a strong smell of like what's basically shit comes through the room. I think it's the plumbing or something, as they're still building new houses down the road from my place, so trucks come and go by all the time. Immediately as I lift my head up, the rosary flings through the air, 2 to 3 meters toward the door, as if somebody had taken it off the window and thrown it. I look where it's at now, thinking to myself, what the hell? I come out of the room and tell Mom, who thinks I should pray more, and we put the rosary back in its place. I didn't feel uneasy or anything when it happened, and I'm not exactly a devout Christian like they are, but I do respect their religious beliefs, so I pray. The last one I have for you is when I was 17 years old. I was having dinner with my parents and my little brother. He was 3. My mother finishes and sits in the living room. I'm sitting in front of my brother, and my dad is between us at the top of the table. The dinner table top is made of glass. This time it doesn't have any sheets on top because they're being washed or something, I don't quite remember. My dad and I are talking, and my little brother is just eating his dinner slowly. In the middle of our conversation, my dad and I notice that my brother's plastic cup of water is floating in the air, about 10 to 15 centimeters into the air. Dad and I stop talking and immediately look at the cup. It starts rotating clockwise in the air and begins moving to the side at the same altitude. We're in awe looking at this cup while my bro is heads down eating and my mom is watching TV. After a few seconds that felt like minutes, the cup just stops in the air and slowly sets back down on the dinner table. Dad looks at me and just says, "Hey, I guess your brother has telepathic powers, eh?" My mom asks what we're talking about, and we tell her, and she immediately grabs my brother and holds him because she's scared. Dad and I aren't scared, but we're more amazed at what just happened, especially because he and I knew what we saw, and we clearly saw it happen. The only non-paranormal explanation I could come up with was that maybe the water under the cup, due to condensation, and the glass at the top of the dinner table made like the illusion that it had moved or something. However, there was no water between the point where the cup lifted into the air and the point when it was dropped down. Something definitely moved it in front of us, possibly the same thing that messed with me before and after this event. So I used to work with an events company, and one event took us to downtown Houston. It was this small party that was at the Houston Library. Anyone that's worked in this sort of job knows that you often work split shifts. You set up before the event starts, you go home to get some sleep while the event's going on, and then you come back and work overnight to tear it down. Since this one was so small, it was just me and a handful of other guys. One of them goes off by himself to take down some lights. Let's call him George. George is on a big ladder by an upstairs window, pulling down lights. George is by one of those arched windows on the left-hand side. I'm walking by and George stops me. He tells me that he hears music inside the building. I listen, and sure enough, I can hear a violin. I figure maybe someone left a radio on or something like that on the inside. I tell George to just ignore it. It's not really our job to find out if there's anybody still in the building or not. And George looks at me and tells me it's moving, and I'm not sure what he means. George says he's been hearing the music move past him, back and forth. I listen closely. I sit there and just listen. He's right. The sound of the violin is traveling from one window to the next and then back again. And I think, oh great, there's some ghost music in here. Now, George is Hispanic and incredibly superstitious, so I tell him to hurry up before the ghost gets him, and I've actually never seen that man work so fast in my life. By the time we're done tearing down, everyone's aware of the ghost violinist. We stand there for a while, staring up at the windows, listening to the music in the dark. It's actually a really beautiful piece. I still wonder what it was to this day. I found out later that the old groundskeeper used to play violin, and that he and his dog are said to haunt the building. Rest in peace, old timer. You were one hell of a fiddler. This is a story that was handed down to me. It's about my grandpa, and roughly goes like this. My grandpa is a young man living in Sweden. He's exploring the woods with his friends. They've spent their entire lives in and out of the woods. They know every inch of it. But one day they come across these huge boulders that have inexplicably popped up in an area where they really shouldn't be. Boulders are covered in patches of moss and mushrooms, very unnatural looking, almost like they're deliberately adorned. One of my grandpa's friends says they're trolls, and they all get spooked because it's sunset and trolls are supposed to move around after dark. They race out of there and head for home. The next day, they go back to investigate, and now the boulders are gone. So my uncle lived with me and my folks when I was growing up. I was about 10 years old when I found him dead in his room. He had killed himself by slashing his wrist with a box cutter. The walls, the floor, and even the ceiling had so much blood on them. I remember standing in the doorway, and I remember screaming. My dad rushed over to see what was the matter. The thing that sticks out in my memory the most is the ceiling fan on high, spinning and creaking repetitively overhead. Then, it's all a blur. Fast forward to my uncle's funeral, which comes and goes. His old room is cleaned and emptied of all furniture. The door to his room is always kept closed. Nobody goes in there for months. One night, I wake up from a terrible dream. In this dream, I'm standing in my uncle's doorway. He's sitting on the edge of his bed staring at me. His wrists are all slashed to hell. His arms are abnormally long in the dream, so it makes them look even worse. The ceiling fan is creaking repetitively, spinning above me. Creak, creak, creak. I sit up on the bed. I'm awake now, but I still hear the sound. Creak, creak. I lay there a second listening to it. I'm not imagining this. For some reason, I slip out of bed and into the hall. Looking back, I didn't really feel in control of my own body at the time. I approach my uncle's bedroom door. On the other side, I can hear the ceiling fan spinning loudly, clear as day. The image of my uncle from my dream pops into my head. I picture his long arm reaching over to open the door. For whatever reason, I turn the handle, and I push the door open slightly, and peek inside. The room is empty. I breathe a sigh of relief, and look up at the fan. It's not even on. But I still hear the creaking noise. I suddenly panic and try to close the door, but at the last second I feel someone tug on it from the inside, keeping it from closing. And I think, screw this, abandon ship. I rush to my room, I jump under the covers. I think I hear the door once again close, but my heart is beating in my ears, so I don't know if I imagined it. I lay there for a long time listening to the creaking sound, until I pass out from exhaustion, or fear. I don't really know which one. This didn't happen to me, but instead it happened to my father-in-law. So my father-in-law grew up in a rural area of Japan, and he would constantly explore around the nearby woods. In July one day, it was getting late, around 7 to 8, when he was heading home. He noticed someone in the woods with him. It was this girl that was around his age at the time. She was dressed normally, but didn't say anything other than screaming for him to get help. My father-in-law runs back into town and tells the story about the girl screaming for help to his parents. They tell some nearby neighbors who say that they're going to go look into it. In the meantime, apparently the parents are more concerned about seeing the girl than someone being in trouble. For about 3 weeks afterwards, my father-in-law would have a recurring nightmare about the girl where she's just screaming, but instead of eyes, there are simply black pits. Eventually, the nightmare isn't recurring anymore, and it just kind of stops for about a week. And he's just sitting in his house one day, he's in the kitchen making a snack, when he unmistakably sees the same girl in his house. He makes a run for it and locks the door. He tells a neighbor, and they search every corner of the house, but there's no sign of anyone being there besides him. One night this girl would appear in his bedroom. Once again, empty pits for eyes, but she disappeared just as soon as she had appeared. After a while of sightings, he went to a Shinto priest in the town to explain what had been going on for some time. The priest tells him something along the lines of an evil spirit had followed him and is trying to ruin him. The priest performs a ceremony to keep the spirit at bay, not banish it, but it can no longer directly harm him. At around age 19, my father-in-law moves into an apartment in Kyoto, and the sightings have been sparse, but one night he was watching TV and heard a knock on his apartment door, so he gets up and opens it, and there's no one in front of his door, but he looks down the hall and sees the girl again. About 2 years after that, of very sparse sightings, my father-in-law immigrates to America with his wife. And if I have my timeline right, this would be about 1987 or so, I think. So my father-in-law and wife had come to America and were living in California at this time. My father-in-law is working on cleaning up the house's garage when he hears the door to the garage open up. He turns around and sees the empty-eyed girl, and she's looking really, visibly angry. She disappears. After a few minutes, he begins to hear loud slamming on the garage door. My father-in-law describes it as if somebody had repeatedly thrown themselves at the garage door, full force. He lifts the door, but there's no one there. 2 years later, his son would be born, and on the morning after his birth, he saw the empty-eyed girl throughout the hospital wherever he went. This time, however, he stood his ground. No words were exchanged, but he apparently stared down the entity. He said he could feel the absolute anger this thing gave off. Yes, he would refer to the empty-eyed girl as a thing. About 4 years after this, his daughter was born, and he saw the empty-eyed girl once again. From then on, sightings of the entity would happen in cycles, where it would appear, and then there would be some activity, and then after that it would stop for weeks, months, and some occasions even years. So fast forward to some years later, my father-in-law is with me. We're hanging out at mine and my fiance's place. He says that he can see the empty-eyed girl again, right outside of our window. He tells me the story of the girl and the sightings of her, tells me that he's sure that he'll have to face it when he dies. He apparently had seen her again at my wedding in 2016. My father-in-law passed away last June, not of any virus, but he had a brain aneurysm immediately after winning a poker game with his co-workers. 2 weeks prior to his death, though, He admitted to me that he knew that he didn't have much time left and that he could feel death was coming, and he knew that the girl could possibly be waiting for him. What do you think of those stories? Do you think they were real, or do you think they were all fake? Let me know down in the comments. And there's still a video that's coming on Sunday, as usual. This one is on Albania, so tune in for that one. If you like the video, like and subscribe. If you have your own experience, you can send it in, and it'll probably make it into a video in the future. And yeah, thank you all for pulling up a stump, and thank you all for watching. Have a great week, or weekend, or whenever you're watching this.